Republic of Iran, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Turkey to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. Geir Pedersen, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, and Mrs. Edem Bosorno, Director of Operations and Advocacy of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Geir Pedersen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since March 2020, the Syrian conflict has been in the kind of a strategic stalemate, characterized by static front lines, persistent violence, and sporadic escalations, with de facto authorities entrenching their control and 5 foreign armies present and active. However, I have long warned that this status quo leaves Syria at risk of drifting into deeper and prolonged fragmentation, and that it involves escalation risks of the most frightening kind. My warnings have grown louder this year as we have seen growing instability and violence exacerbated by the lack of a meaningful political process. Today, I'm sounding an alarm that the situation is now at its most dangerous for a long time. Mr. President, I say this because on top of the violence emanating from the Syrian conflict itself, the Syrian people now face a terrifying prospect of a potential wider escalation, given the alarming developments in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory and the region. Spillover into Syria is not just a risk, it has already begun. Airstrikes attributed to Israel have hit Aleppo and Damascus airports several times during the reporting period, temporarily halting the UN's humanitarian air service, which operates from those airports and services Syria's humanitarian programs. In addition, Israel says it has responded with artillery, mortar, and airstrikes towards what they said were a number of launches from Syria towards Israel on the occupied Syrian Golan, with further exchanges again this morning. The Syrian government says some of its soldiers were killed and injured in these strikes, as well as civilian workers in the strikes on the airports. Meanwhile, the US says its forces have faced multiple attacks by groups that it claims are backed by Iran, including on Syrian territory. Last week, the US then carried out strikes on facilities in Syria that it claims are used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and groups that it backs. Further exchanges were reported again this morning. Mr. President, with the wider region at its most dangerous and tense in a very long time, fuel is being added to a tinderbox that was already beginning to ignite. Even before the regional developments, Syria was seeing the worst surge in violence in more than 3 years. And I deeply deplore the fact that this violence has already left civilians killed, maimed, and displaced in higher numbers than at any point since 2020. There has been a significant intensification of attacks on government-controlled areas. This includes a deadly attack on the graduation ceremony of a military academy in Homs, which remains unclaimed and which the government attributed to terrorist organizations, as well as further attacks in subsequent days. It also includes reports of rocket attacks throughout October from Security Council-listed Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Hundreds were reportedly injured and many dozens killed, among them civilians, including women and children. Pro-government bombardment in the northwest has escalated to levels echoing those at the height of the conflict before 2020. This displaced more than 120,000 civilians at its height and caused significant damage to critical services and infrastructure, including health facilities, schools, and camps. Hundreds of civilians have reportedly been injured, with dozens killed, among them women and children, as well as aid workers. Following a terrorist attack on Turkish government facilities in Ankara, the Northeast has seen one of the largest escalations in years, with reports of Turkish strikes, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and reports of casualties, including civilians. The Syrian Democratic Forces claim they subsequently killed Turkish soldiers inside Syrian territory, with reports of SDF strikes on civilian areas too. Meanwhile, Security Council-listed terrorist group ISIL remains active, continued its attacks on forces, particularly in Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, and the Central Desert region in Homs Governorate. Mr. President, this is what the Syrian civilian population has endured in the past month alone. Let me remind you that all of the other sources of pain and instability that I have consistently briefed on remain unchanged and as acute as ever. The Syrian economy remains in a dire and worsening state. Critical infrastructure remains degraded and destroyed. The humanitarian situation is alarming, as you will hear from OCHA shortly. Reports continue of arbitrary arrests, of torture and deaths in custody. There is no meaningful movement on the file of the detained, disappearing, and missing. Refugees do not see conditions for safe, dignified, and voluntary returns emerging. Quite the opposite, in fact, with the re-emergence of extensive hostilities. Though I should mention, a recent Syrian government statement on refugees contained elements that need further exploration. And popular frustration clearly remains heightened, with protests in Al-Shuaida ongoing now for more than 2 months. Mr. President, Syria, the Syrian people, and the wider region are in no position to endure new explosions of violent conflict in Syria, whether caused by internal or external dynamics. And we are seeing now the hard reality that without real engagement and progress towards a political solution of the Syrian conflict, any stability is only wafer thin, and when it breaks apart, it can unleash mass forces of violence and instability. There is a real and growing danger of this in Syria. The only antidote would be an immediate de-escalation to stem the tide of violence and to refocus on a credible political process that charts a path forward in a framework that fully respects and restores Syria's sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity, and that enables the Syrian people to realize their legitimate aspirations in line with Security Council Resolution 2254. Mr. President, I fear complacency has set in about the lack of such a process today. Regrettably, months of intensive efforts have still not yielded consensus on the venue for resuming the Constitutional Committee, nor on its substance, but my consultations continue. Proposals to advance step-for-step confidence-building measures are on the table. The recent regional developments have temporarily slowed down consultations on these matters, but we need to come back to them without delay. Indeed, I continue to work with the same commitment as ever on advancing these and all other aspects of the political process to implement Security Council Resolution 2254. I have been engaging and will continue to engage with the Syrian government and Syrian Negotiations Commission. I also continue to engage a wide range of Syrians, including through the Civil Society Support Room and Women's Advisory Board, with whom I met last week, and who, once again, demonstrated the importance of women's full and effective participation in the political process. However, Mr. President, right now, today, I have 4 immediate messages to you. First, we need urgent de-escalation within Syria. We urgently need to work to reinstate calm towards a nationwide ceasefire, alongside a cooperative approach to countering Security Council-listed terrorist groups in line with international law. Second, we need all actors, Syrian and non-Syrian, to exercise maximum restraint. It is particularly indefensible that Syria seems to be treated as a free-for-all space in which different actors can settle their scores with one another with impunity. Decisions that are outside of Syrian hands cannot be allowed to drag Syria into another war. Third, we need all actors to operate in full compliance with international humanitarian law, including protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure, and strictly upholding the principles of distinction and proportionality. Fourth, we need all key international actors to keep channels open and cooperate despite the rising tensions on multiple fronts. I will make every effort to contribute to promoting this. I will continue to prioritize contacts with the Astana, Arab, and Western players individually and collectively, and work to foster joint efforts at de-escalation and advancing the political process. Mr. President, this is the only way to de-escalate the current violence and protect the possibility of the political process to implement Security Council Resolution 2254. Complacency cannot be the answer. If it is, then I fear the already fraying status quo may fully collapse, bringing untold misery to the Syrian civilians and radiating further instability across a region that is already at breaking point. We must de-escalate and de-escalate now for the sake of Syria. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Pedersen for his briefing, and I'll give the floor to Ms. Edem Bosorno.
Thank you, Mr. President. In recent weeks, the world's attention has been fixed on the crisis in Israel and OPT, and rightly so. But at the same time, we must not turn away from humanitarian crises that persist elsewhere on a vast scale, including in the same region. I join you today from Cairo, having spent the past week visiting a number of countries in the region, including Syria. I therefore appreciate this opportunity to update you on the humanitarian situation in Syria, where the humanitarian emergency has continued to deepen in the weeks since our last meeting. This month, as you heard from the Special Envoy, several areas across northern Syria experience a serious escalation in hostilities. In northwest Syria, we have seen the most significant escalation in violence since 2019. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, at least 70 civilians have been killed as of 20th of October, including 36 women and 14 children. The civilian fatalities span both government areas, notably, as the Special Envoy has said, the drone attack on the Homs Military Academy graduation ceremony on 5 October, and non-government areas. Many more have been injured. Over the span of 2 weeks, from 5 to 18 October, more than 120 people were displaced in Idlib and Western Aleppo. The hostilities also damaged critical infrastructure and services, including more than 40 health facilities, 24 schools, and more than 20 water systems. This also temporarily affected the main power station in Idlib. Attacks, including airstrikes and artillery shelling, have continued on a near daily basis, with reports of more people being killed and injured in the past week, including, alarmingly, a growing number of children. One of these children was Sami, a 15-year-old boy who was displaced to Idlib city 4 years ago and whose father, Nabil, works as a driver for a national NGO that partners with the United Nations. He died on 26 October, along with his childhood friend Ali, due to shelling in Idlib city. His mother told OCHA colleagues that the boys had gathered that day to play football. She said, "We are afraid all the time with the increasing fighting, and we try to stay inside. We need to be protected. We want to live in peace and security." While about half of those displaced by the violence have reportedly returned to their homes, many tens of thousands remain fearful of returning, further adding to the cohort of 2.9 million people already displaced in the Northwest. And reports have continued to emerge of additional displacement in recent days. Women and girls, who make up to 80% of those in displacement camps and informal sites, continue to bear the most severe consequences. They face, as reported before, pervasive threats of gender-based violence and barriers to accessing services and assistance. Hostilities have impeded life-saving sexual and reproductive health care and gender-based violence services. Let me turn to the Northeast, where a spike in hostilities earlier this month damaged a range of critical civilian infrastructure, including power stations and water facilities, has also been said, in Al-Haseka, Kamishli, Tal Tamer, and other areas. Disruptions to electricity have impacted water and health facilities and increased the demand for fuel for generators and heating as the winter months approach. This has further inflated already high prices for fuel, transportation, food, and other commodities. While many services have been restored, these disruptions to already precarious electricity, water, and fuel supplies continue to make life extremely challenging for a vulnerable population and place a heightened demand on overstretched humanitarian services. Mr. President, I again echo the Secretary General in urging all parties across Syria to respect their obligations under international law. Parties must take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects, including essential infrastructure, in accordance with international humanitarian law. The Special Envoy spoke to these issues as well. The escalation in hostilities has also had a deep impact on humanitarian workers and operations, particularly in the northwest of the country. 3 aid workers were among those killed, and many organizations were forced to temporarily suspend operations. Some activities, including nutrition services and safe spaces for women and girls, remain suspended. Nevertheless, the UN and humanitarian partners have continued efforts to get critical assistance to those affected by the conflict. This includes the provision of clean water, waste management, food, tents, protection services, and emergency medical supplies, including sexual and reproductive health services, supplies to displaced women, and services to displaced people generally, and includes the provision of vital support to health facilities. In particular, the ability to deliver assistance at scale across the border from Turkey has been indispensable in meeting the vast and increasing humanitarian needs. In the past 6 weeks, some 251 trucks have brought in critical supplies through Bab al-Hawa and Bab al-Salam crossings. We have asked the government of Syria to extend its permission for the use of the Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai crossings beyond 13 November, for as long as humanitarian needs continue to ensure we can provide essential humanitarian assistance in a predictable and sustainable way. As part of our commitment to providing assistance to those who need it by whatever means possible, we continue efforts to facilitate the cross-line delivery of supplies to key areas in the Northwest and throughout the country, and we shall continue to do so. Mr. President, if the escalation in hostilities were not enough, the continued economic crisis, including the steep decline in the Syrian pound and high inflation rates, is contributing to raising prices for food and other items to further record highs. The combined impact of all these factors is not only piling immense pressure on an already vulnerable population, a story I heard when I was in Syria, it is also increasing the reliance on humanitarian assistance for basic survival. Consider, for example, Ahmad, a single mother in Hama, who was forced to make the difficult choice to pull her son out of school so he could help support the family. Her story is becoming increasingly common. It is with deep concern, therefore, that I report that we've seen little improvement over the past month in the serious funding shortfalls affecting our operations. 10 months into the year, the Syria Humanitarian Response Plan has received $1.6 billion of the $5.4 billion requested. We are deeply appreciative to the donors for their support, and we continue to count on their support for more funding. As we have repeatedly warned, this is translating into a significant constraint on our ability to provide critical assistance throughout the country, including reductions in food distributions, the closure of safe spaces for women and girls, and the scaling back of health services in medical facilities. It is even more concerning as we approach the winter season with an estimated 5.7 million people across the country in need of humanitarian support for critical shelter and household items. These are life-saving items in the cold months. We are doing what we can to prioritize assistance within the resources available. The United Nations Syria Humanitarian Fund and Syria Cross-Border Humanitarian Fund are allocating nearly $50 million to mitigate the impact of the harsh winter conditions in vulnerable communities. This includes the provision of tents and shelter, household items, water, and sanitation support, and cash-based assistance, as well as efforts to boost early recovery and resilience. But without additional funding, without additional resources, many people will go without the support they need to get through the harsh winter months. Mr. President, this is deeply concerning this is a deeply concerning time for the region and indeed for the world. And there is no shortage of crises crying out for our attention. But with more than 15 million people in need of critical humanitarian and protection support, in ever more challenging conditions, the situation in Syria is one that unquestionably demands our continued focus and attention. I thank you.
I thank Mrs. Wosorno for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen and Ms. Wosorno, for your continued attention to the ongoing conflict and dire humanitarian needs in Syria. Colleagues, before Hamas's horrific terrorist attacks against Israel on October 7th, the special envoy warned this council that increased military activity in Syria had the potential to spill over into neighboring countries. Unfortunately, the special envoy's words proved prescient. Terrorist groups, some backed by the Syrian regime and Iran, are threatening to expand the conflict beyond Gaza by using Syrian territory to plot and launch attacks against Israel. We've also seen attacks on U.S. forces in Syria, whose mission has been and continues to be to defeat Daesh. The Syrian regime has allowed Iran and terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, to use its international airports for military purposes. By doing so, the Assad regime has put civilian travelers at those airports at risk. The regime should stop playing the victim card. It is fully within the regime's power to prevent Iran from using Syrian civilian airports to transport weapons and fighters that are then used to threaten neighboring states. We call on the regime to curb the activities of Iran-backed militias in Syria, stop the flow of foreign arms and fighters through its territory, and cease escalatory actions in the Golan Heights. The United States has warned all actors not to take advantage of the situation in Gaza to widen or deepen the conflict. And we've made clear that we will respond to attacks on our own personnel and facilities in Syria or against U.S. interests, and where appropriate, exercise our right to self-defense forcefully, proportionately, and in a manner that minimizes civilian harm. The narrowly tailored U.S. strikes on Iranian militia sites in eastern Syria on October 27th were in response to repeated attacks on U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq since October 17th, and were an appropriate exercise of our right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. No one can argue U.S. strikes were or will be without warning. And as U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin stated, after the recent strikes, the United States will not hesitate to take further necessary measures to protect our people. Colleagues, at this perilous moment for the region, the protection of civilians must be at the forefront. We're outraged by the relentless attacks carried out by the Assad regime and by Russian attacks in northern Syria, which have killed scores of civilians, displaced over 100,000 people, and destroyed vital infrastructure. In just the last week, the regime or its Russian allies struck a displacement camp in northwest Syria, killing innocent children. And we continue to see attacks on schools and medical facilities. Neither the Assad regime nor Russia has even tried to offer a plausible explanation for these horrors. For years now, their strategy has been to deny, deflect, and disinform, to claim that anyone who opposes them is a terrorist and any target they choose is legitimate and any report of civilian harm is fabricated. That is not how responsible nations behave. It is not the standard to which the United States holds itself or to which we hold our partners and allies. The Assad regime in Russia will no doubt take the floor to decry our support for Israel. The difference is that democracies conduct military operations in self-defense and in a way intended to minimize civilian harm. They do not intentionally target civilians. Colleagues, on the political front, we're closely monitoring the 2-month sustained protests, many led by women in southern Syria, including Suwaida and Daras. We fully support Syrians' freedom of expression and peaceful assembly including when exercised in protest in pursuit of dignity, freedom, security, and justice. These protests also underscore the need for a Syrian-focused and Syrian-led solution to the conflict. Special Envoy Pedersen, we commend your continued focus on the political track in line with Resolution 2254, despite the Assad regime's obstructionism. Resolution 2254 remains the only viable roadmap for a lasting solution to the conflict. And we must work to identify all avenues to advance the stalled political process, including by supporting the important work of the Women's Advisory Board. While we work toward a sustainable political solution, we must also continue to address the dire humanitarian situation. The United States welcomes the continued flow of UN convoys across the Turkey-Syria border, which provides life-saving aid to millions in need, as we heard from Ms. Warsanu. But we're mindful that the UN's arrangement with the regime regarding the Bab al-Salam and al-Ray crossings could lapse as soon as November 13th. There's no reason why this arrangement should not be renewed, and we urge the Assad regime to do so. We must all urge the regime to do so. This council must give the UN the support it needs to maintain unhindered access to all Syrians through all modalities for as long as needed. And this council and all member states must continue to stand with the Syrian people in their time of need. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we would like to thank the special envoy, Geir Pedersen, and Ms. Vasono for presenting their reports on the humanitarian situation. The situation in Syria is extremely tense still, inter alia, because of the unprecedented spike in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The current tensions on the Israeli border, along with illegal armed presences in the north and east, is also problematic for the Syrian Arab Republic. Over this month, the Israel armed forces have struck sites in Syria. There were targets such as important civilian facilities, such as the Damascus airport. Thus, there was real threats to the lives of civilians who weren't guilty of anything. And we're not even talking about the impact on the air work of UN, because they are involved in air transfers as well for humanitarian purposes. Furthermore, in October, the US forces under Biden's order struck targets in Bukiman in Syria. Washington stated that the attack was undertaken as part of the self-defense right that the U.S. had. And this is thousands and thousands of kilometers away from U.S. territory. Washington's illegitimate actions is a gross violation of Syria's sovereignty. There is a sharp increase in tensions around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and these kinds of actions are fraught with complicated issues because it might provoke a spillover to the entire region. This must not be deemed acceptable. The American representatives talked mostly in her a statement about accusations against Syria and Russia. Unlike the US, I'd like to underscore, are targeting the terrorist organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that has been dubbed such by many nations, a terrorist organization, by the Security Council, rather. A clear example of Washington's interference here is the area around the Euphrates and the clashes there with Arabs and Kurds, and the Suwaida incidents. There, clearly the US's economic interests have superseded other interests. So these economic interests have been clearly something that have prevailed over political interests as well. Given this, the US and its Western allies have taken a significant area in Syria. They're involved in contraband with Syrian grain and oil. They are using various excuses on supplying Kurds with arms, who are then being used against Arab tribes into Alia in the Turkish border area as well. Here, the IAF is helping them with indiscriminate airstrikes on the Deir ez-Zor province. There is something positive, the development of a multifaceted cooperation plan with Damascus and other countries promoting economic cooperation and other forms of cooperation of significance in order to get Syria out of the isolation artificially imposed upon it, is the expansion of links with other countries in the region, or not in the region, rather. On the political track, we still see no alternative to push forward the political process in the Syrian Arab Republic that needs to be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned under the auspices of or supported by the UN in line with 2254 and respecting the territorial integrity, independence and sovereignty of that country. In this regard, we are convinced that there's a need to continue direct inter-Syrian dialogue. The main forum for this was and will still always be the Constitutional Committee. This process must not be hampered by any other processes that are not supported by the country. We continue to believe that fundamental decisions about next rounds of the Constitutional Committee meetings and the venue must be taken by the Syrians themselves without any interference from outside. Any attempts to provide alternative fora have no justification whatsoever. No efforts are being made either to settle the situation with the ongoing terrorist enclave in Idlib. After the drawdown of the cross-border mechanism, the Tahrir al-Sham terrorist unit basically de facto blocked off humanitarian access in that area. Despite the sovereign decision of the Syrian government to use the Bab al-Hala as a crossing point for goods, the first convoy was only able to access in September, in the 19th of September. And it was just 159 trucks that managed to cross. That was based on individual agreements with the office in Idlib that agreed to receive assistance irrespective of Damascus and had to work to reach agreements with the terrorist organization. The access across the crossing points, or cross-line access rather, still doesn't exist, which is something we do not believe to be acceptable. We believe that after the Security Council Resolution 2072 was not extended, international assistance has to be upheld with the in line with the General Assembly Resolution 46/182 on guiding principles. So in close coordination and solely with the agreement of the host country. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this joint statement on behalf of the 3 African members of the Security Council. We thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and OCHA Director of Operations Edem Osonu for their briefings and welcome the participation of the representatives of the Syrian Arab Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Turkey in this meeting. The A3 is alarmed by the resumption of armed violence in Syria. The recent armed clashes along the front lines highlight the precarious nature of the security situation in Syria and the continuing inability of the international community to assist the Syrian people to find a lasting solution to the country's crisis. In particular, we condemn in the strongest terms the 5th October attack on a military academic graduation ceremony in Homs, which claimed over 100 lives, including civilians. We are also deeply concerned that retaliatory attacks have turned the northern part of the country into a hotbed of armed hostilities with increasing number of civilian casualties. Critical civilian infrastructure, including health, water, schools, and power facilities, have regrettably been targeted, depriving civilians of access to essential services. We condemn the targeting of defenseless civilians and civilian infrastructure and remind the parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law and relevant resolutions of the Council. Mr. President, as expected, within the context of escalating violence, serious protection concerns have risen. At least 61 civilians have been killed and some 123,000 people displaced from 91 communities in the Northwest. Women and children continue to pay the highest price. Parties to the conflict must refrain from any action that infringe the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of women and girls. Their fundamental human rights, including their right to work and education, must be preserved at all times. It bears reminding the parties that there can be no winners amid such relentless violence. Instead, the suffering of the people of Syria continue to rise with each bombing or violent clash. As the war drags on, so is Syria continually losing its rightful place among the Committee of Nations. For this reason, we call for an immediate nationwide ceasefire to create a conducive environment for the political processes to commence. The most workable solution to the conflict remains a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned inclusive political process undertaken with the support of the international community under the facilitative role of the United Nations as detailed in Resolution 2254. In pursuit of this goal, it is crucial for the parties to maintain strong cooperation with the UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and support his efforts, including his step-for-step process, to find a lasting political solution to the conflict. Breaking the current deadlock in the small body of the Constitutional Committee meeting will be a significant step in that direction. Mr. President, in the midst of this escalating violence, it is deeply concerning that Syria continues to come under repeated attacks from various foreign forces, sometimes targeting civilian infrastructure and disrupting humanitarian aid distribution in the country in contravention of international humanitarian law. We renew our call for respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria and for the full withdrawal of all foreign forces from the country. Another issue of major concern is the recent mutual shelling between militants in Syria and the Israeli Defense Forces over the Golan Heights. Given the current dynamics in the Middle East region, such attacks, if not checked, raise the prospect of a dangerous escalation of the volatile security situation in the region with grave consequences for global peace and security. Mr. President, on the humanitarian front, the A3 is deeply concerned that the current rate of violent hostilities could exacerbate the suffering of the Syrian people. As outlined in today's briefings, thousands of civilians in the northwest are displaced because of the renewed fighting, with women and girls particularly vulnerable as they are further exposed to gender-based violence in displacement camps. In fact, gender-based violence, forced and early marriage, denial of resources and opportunities have become part of the daily reality of women and girls in Syria. It is also distressing to note that as many as 12 million people in Syria remain food insecure. At the same time, necessities such as water and electricity are in short supply, with millions having to live without them. The approaching winter season is a common nightmare for many families living in camps, with over 5 million said to be in urgent need of winterization support. Unfortunately, funding shortages is inhibiting the ability of aid agencies to provide this critical humanitarian support to all those in need. The financial outlook of the Syrian humanitarian response plan remains grim in the face of increasing needs. With less than 30% funding, humanitarian agencies are compelled to choose between the hungry and the starving. As a result of such difficult choices, 2.5 million Syrians who are food insecure are no longer receiving food or cash. The people of Syria still need our assistance. We renew our urgent appeal to the international community to support the humanitarian cause in the country to ease the pains of the needy population. In pursuit of this cause, the A3 assures of its full support for every modality of aid delivery that brings relief to the most vulnerable people. We enjoin the parties to work closely with the United Nations to create a safe and secure environment for the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid through all available modalities. We are cognizant of the fact that there is currently no substitute in size and scope to the cross-border aid delivery due to the large number of beneficiaries under the mechanism. In view of its immense importance, the A3 entreats the Syrian national government to renew the authorization for the use of the Bab al-Salam, al-Rai, and al-Hawa border crossings before they expire next month and in January 2024, respectively, to ensure uninterrupted flow of life-saving support into the area. However, notwithstanding the wider reach of the cross-border delivery mechanisms, the A3 is united in its view that aid delivery across the front lines is equally essential and must be increased to supplement the cross-border deliveries. In addition, considering the current funding challenges, it will greatly inure to the benefit of many communities if donors prioritize early recovery and livelihood activities as a way of building their resilience to reduce dependence on external aid. Mr. President, in concluding, the A3 reiterates its collective call for a nationwide ceasefire and the immediate resumption of negotiations among the parties towards a political settlement that will bring a comprehensive and lasting peace and stability to Syria, in line with Resolution 2254 of 2015. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Let me begin by thanking Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Vosorno for their briefings. At a time of escalated regional violence and tensions, your messages of practical steps towards peace and dignity are crucial. Since we have last met to discuss Syria, a deadly increase in military activity has gripped the northwest of the country, most notably the 5th October attack on a Syrian military graduation ceremony in the city of Homs. Hostilities and government strikes in the northwest have damaged critical infrastructure such as power and water networks. The Aluk water station is yet non-functioning. These attacks have also resulted in the killing of over 61 civilians and the displacement of over 100,000 people from 91 affected communities. Israeli airstrikes on Damascus and Aleppo international airports have further destabilized the regional situation and have disrupted crucial UNHA's flights for those working on the Syrian response. Put simply, the conflict continues to rage in Syria. A spillover from the ongoing tensions in Israel and Gaza can only further exacerbate an already volatile situation. President, within this context, the humanitarian situation across the country remains perilous. Millions lack water due to chronic fuel shortages, violence, and impact of climate change. Ahead of winter months, there remains an urgent need for winterization support for nearly 6 million internally displaced Syrians. 12.1 million people remain food insecure, with 2.5 million no longer receiving food or cash transfers due to underfunding. Protection needs to remain at the heart of this crisis. As we have heard today, acute protection needs for tens of thousands of displaced in the northwest remain largely unaddressed, with gender-based violence and early and forced marriage a daily reality for Syrian women and girls. Against this backdrop, we urge greater resourcing of the Syrian Humanitarian Response Plan, which remains critically underfunding at 29.4%, as we have heard also today from Director Vosorno. Greater humanitarian protection and early recovery, resilience and livelihood support are needed now more than ever. The humanitarian crossings at Bab al-Hawa, Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai remain a critical lifeline for millions of the most vulnerable civilians in the northwest. Malta reaffirms its support for the delivery of humanitarian aid via all modalities and calls for the authorization of each of these crossings to be renewed for as long as the needs persist. President, as outlined by Special Envoy Pedersen, only a political solution in line with UNSCR 2254 can resolve the root causes of this crisis and provide the safety, dignity, and justice which Syrians long deserve. Notwithstanding the regional escalation of recent weeks, the momentum which has built towards the convening of the Syrian Constitutional Committee must be maintained. The body must resume its work without delay. All players, including the Astana format, the Arab Contact Group, must come together to continue the vital work of finding solutions to this conflict, which has caused too much misery, far too many fought for too long. This must be accompanied by meaningful, coordinated, reciprocal, and verifiable actions related to the Steps for Steps initiative. This includes progress on the missing, the disappeared, and those arbitrarily detained in Syria. President, in conclusion, Malta urges maximum restraint for all parties in Syria and the region at this time of escalation. We once again reiterate our call for the nationwide ceasefire in Syria and for parties to refrain from further action which could tip the region into greater calamity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I speak on behalf of Brazil and Switzerland, co-pen holders of the Syrian humanitarian file. We thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and the Director of OCHA's Operations and Advocacy Division, Edem Vosornu, for their briefings. We also acknowledge the presence of representatives from Syria, Turkey, and Iran at today's meeting. Brazil and Switzerland remain deeply concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Syria and the increase in hostilities across the country. According to OCHA, the escalation of violence in the northwest has damaged several health facilities and schools and displaced more than 120,000 people across Idlib and western Aleppo. Unsurprisingly, with the lack of security and safety, aid operations have temporarily been disrupted and, sadly, 3 humanitarian aid workers have been killed, as have been dozens of civilians. The northeast has been also affected by the increased hostilities. Civilian infrastructure, including water and power stations, farms, sites in direct vicinity of civilian villages and IDP camps have been targeted. The attacks, including on infrastructures that are indispensable to the survival of the population, have caused displacement both within the northeast as well as to the government-controlled areas of Syria. Repeated strikes on Aleppo and Damascus airports have also disrupted UN humanitarian air service flights more than once. Moreover, across the country, the escalations of hostilities have impacted aid delivery as organizations are forced to suspend activities due to security concerns. Any further escalation of hostilities will inevitably obstruct the delivery of life-saving assistance and pose immediate threats to the safety of aid workers and communities alike. It will increase the plight of the civilian population that already faces a humanitarian crisis that is worse than ever in Syria's 12-year history of conflict. A long-lasting ceasefire across the country is the only way to prevent further deaths, injury, and human suffering. We call on all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law, in particular, to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need across all Syria, to follow the rules related to the conduct of hostilities, in particular the prohibition of attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructures, to guarantee the safety and well-being of the people living in Syria. Mr. President, it is worrisome that the humanitarian response plan remains heavily underfunded, with only 1/3 of the requested funds covered. The lack of resources is limiting the UN's and its partners' ability to support the affected population. All modalities of aid, including cross-border and cross-line, must be kept available for humanitarian organizations to be able to keep offering their much-needed assistance across Syria. We appreciate that deliveries of essential humanitarian aid continue to pass through the Bab al-Hawa, Bab al-Salam and Bab al-Ray border crossings. Given the large scale of needs, ensuring humanitarian access remains crucial. We trust that the authorization for Bab al-Salam and al-Ray border crossings, due to expire on 13 November, will be renewed. We also reiterate the necessity of predictable arrangements to respond to those ever-increasing humanitarian needs on the ground, which would be facilitated by open-ended or longer durations of permissions. In closing, the humanitarian situation in Syria is dire, and it risks to keep getting worse. It is important to ensure that recent developments in the region do not contribute to a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Syria. In the midst of conflict and crisis in the Near East, let us not forget the people in Syria. I thank you. Monsieur le Président.
President, I would now like to make a statement in my national capacity on the political situation in Syria. Switzerland is very concerned about the risk of regional escalation resulting from the conflict in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territory since the 7th of October. We support the efforts of Special Envoy Pedersen, whom I thank for his briefing, to immunize Syria as much as possible from such a scenario. The repeated attacks on Damascus and Aleppo airports over the past 3 weeks and the firing on the occupied Golan Heights are just one example of how the repercussions of the Middle East conflict are already being felt in Syria. We regret that the current situation is further hampering efforts to relaunch the political process and the work of the Constitutional Committee on the basis of Resolution 2254. The security situation, particularly in the north of the country, has deteriorated significantly in recent weeks. In northwest Syria, the attack on a military academy in Homs on the 5th of October resulted in the deaths of dozens of people, including many civilians. The bombardments that followed in various parts of the Idlib region and to the west of Aleppo had serious repercussions on the civilian population and led to large-scale displacement. In the northeast, the upsurge in violence has also affected the population and many civilian infrastructures. Respect for international humanitarian law and the protection of civilians are a priority for Switzerland. This is why we are calling on all parties to establish a national ceasefire and to ensure the protection of civilians. It is essential that all parties respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law and the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution in the conduct of hostilities. The protection of civilian population and civilian property, including infrastructure indispensable to the survival of civilians, such as water supplies, is imperative. President, in this period of high regional and international tension, it is vital to remain attentive to civil society, which is the only one capable of taking the pulse of the situation on the ground and capturing the aspirations, grievances and expectations of the population, particularly women. Switzerland therefore reiterates its support for civil society organizations active inside and outside Syria, which play a crucial role in easing the tensions and conflicts still at work in the country. We welcome the transmission role played by the Civil Society Support Room and the Women's Advisory Board under the aegis of the UN in Geneva. Platforms such as these enable the voices of Syrian women and men to be heard at international level and all the way up to this Council. Finally, Switzerland recalls that the implementation of confidence-building measures within the meaning of Resolution 2254 and by all parties, including the release of detainees and the clarification of the fate of missing persons, are essential to pave the way for reconciliation in the country. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Vosurnu for their briefings. Today, we heard again the call for resuming the political process based on UN Security Council Resolution 2254 and the need for the Constitutional Committee to reconvene and achieve genuine progress. It's not just a wishful line, but a matter of life and death for millions of Syrians who are deprived of dignity, have their freedom oppressed, and no means to rebuild their shattered lives. Albania reiterates its position that only a political solution based on the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 may bring an end to the suffering in Syria. We welcome the engagement of Special Envoy in this regard and the contribution of Women Advisory Board. It can unlock and provide the necessary conditions to be met for the dignified and safe return of the refugees. It can further ensure that justice is served for those responsible for war crimes, enforced displacement, and torture. This is not just a moral imperative, but a legal obligation under international law and a fundamental element towards reconciliation and prevention of inhuman crimes in the future. It can also shed light for the families whose the fate of their loved ones is unknown. Above all, a renewed political momentum, followed with step-for-step approach, would only guarantee sustainable solutions to the humanitarian and economic tragedy. The reassumption of cross-border aid in northwest Syria from Ab al-Waw, although a positive note, is not enough. The other cross-borders of Bab al-Salam and al-Arey should be extended beyond their deadline, and the continuation of a predictable and measurable life-saving humanitarian flow must be guaranteed for as long as needed. President, we are deeply worried for the intense and systematic artillery and missile attacks by the regime in northwest Syria, which have added an extra layer of misery for ordinary Syrians, and especially to children, women, and girls. In this context, we join the call of Special Envoy for de-escalation and for the national ceasefire to be respected throughout the country and for common sense to prevail. President, in concluding, as mentioned also by others, the balances in the wider region are merely holding together, and the situation in the Middle East has brought dark clouds for the regional peace and also for the future of Syria. And here again, we join the call of Special Envoy for all actors to exercise maximum restraint, and that the regional and international actors must continue their efforts in order to respond wisely to this new reality and avoid any spillover effect for the wider region. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we heard from the briefings by Special Envoy Pedersen and Ms. Vosurnu today, there have been a number of alarming recent events that threatens the already precarious security and humanitarian environment in Syria. I thank both briefers for their detailed briefings. Mr. President, first, the situation in Israel and Palestine has a worrying risk of regional spillover. Already, there are reports of exchanges of cross-border fire in the Golan Heights and the strikes on the Damascus and Aleppo international airports. Japan will continue to work in close cooperation with the international community, including the UN, to calm the situation as soon as possible. Additionally, devastating drone attacks in Homs and retaliatory shelling over Idlib have caused hundreds of casualties, damage to civilian facilities, and further displacement. This constitutes the largest escalation of hostilities in Syria in 4 years, according to the UN Commission of Inquiry and Mr. Pedersen's briefing now. Japan echoes the Secretary General's condemnation of all violence in Syria and reiterates his call for all parties to respect their obligations under international law and protect civilians and civilian infrastructure at all times. Mr. President, the latest violence only worsens the already dire humanitarian situation in Syria. While Japan is pleased that UN aid deliveries into northwest Syria from Turkey have continued this month, we encourage further vital assistance through all modalities, including cross-border and cross-line. It is truly regrettable that the Council couldn't agree to extend the cross-border aid mechanism in northwest Syria in July. As the Syrian government's consent for the use of Bab al-Salam and Arai border crossing expires in November, we hope it will be extended. The lives of millions are at stake. Regarding the political situation, Japan is disappointed that the Constitutional Committee has been unable to reconvene in Geneva or elsewhere, and hopes that a venue can be agreed upon as soon as possible. We further encourage Special Envoy Pedersen's intensive diplomatic efforts to facilitate progress in the step-for-step approach and relaunch a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process in line with Resolution 2254. Creating conditions for the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of refugees and IDPs is also critical. We look forward to receiving more updates from the Secretary General and OHCHR regarding the independent institution to clarify the fate of missing persons in Syria. Syria's rejoining the League of Arab States has sparked hope for a realistic path towards peace and stability in Syria and beyond. In this vein, the role of Arab Contact Group is crucial. However, Japan stresses the need for the Syrian government to participate meaningfully and in good faith in these efforts to move the political process forward. Mr. President, amidst the many conflicts and crises around the world, we must not forget the plight of the Syrian people. This Council must remain engaged, and Japan will spare no efforts to that end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Wasornu for their briefings. As we've heard today, this remains a live conflict and an entrenched humanitarian crisis. I want to set out 3 tangible steps that would improve the situation for the people of Syria, and these overlap very closely with Special Envoy Pedersen's 4 priorities. First, we need to ensure sustainable, predictable, and efficient aid flows across the whole of Syria. There is no substitute for cross-border access to deliver for people in the northwest. Short-term, last-minute agreements are inappropriate. As Director Wasornu just said, we must insist that cross-border access is granted for as long as humanitarian needs demand across all 3 crossing points. We've also heard that humanitarian funding remains inadequate. The UK continues to be a top donor for Syrians in humanitarian need, pledging up to $180 million this year alone. But as a donor, we're concerned that 17 cents of every dollar in aid being sent to UN agencies based in Damascus is being lost to the regime who manipulate exchange rates for their benefit. Secondly, at a fragile moment for the region, all parties should be focused on avoiding further escalation of conflict elsewhere in the Middle East. We're concerned at reports of increased Iranian-affiliated militia activity and increasing hostilities between Israel and militia groups in southern Syria. We call on the regime to prioritize de-escalation and to focus on fostering stability and prosperity. Thirdly, this backdrop of violence in the region underscores even more urgently the need for a viable political process in Syria. We call on the regime to act in good faith and engage. Thus far, attempts at normalization have not borne fruit. Insecurity persists, the Captagon trade continues, and the safe, dignified and voluntary return of refugees remains out of reach. The UK's position has not changed. We will not engage Damascus without evidence of genuine, consistent behaviour change. Resolution 2254 provides the framework to deliver an inclusive and sustainable political process. The Constitutional Committee has been deadlocked for too long. We strongly support efforts to convene a meeting with the Syrian parties alone, if necessary, in Geneva later this year. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, we are grateful for the information provided by Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and by Director Edem Wasornu of OCHA. We welcome the presence here of the permanent representatives of Syria, Turkey, and Iran. Ecuador rejects the violence which imperils the lives and integrity of civilians and echoes the call by the Secretary-General for all parties to commit to bring an end to the escalation in hostilities which further hamper the political and humanitarian situation in Syria and in the region. We express our condolences to the victims of the attacks and violent events in Damascus and Aleppo, which caused the deaths of hundreds of civilians, including women and girls and boys. We reiterate the support to Special Envoy Pedersen in his efforts towards a negotiated solution to the conflict, particularly along with the Astana Group and the League of Arab States. We commend the work underway to increase and shore up the political will of a broad spectrum of stakeholders within and outside Syria, and actions aimed at achieving a ceasefire. We share the Special Envoy's concern that this disruption in the political negotiation process threatens to reverse the progress made in previous months around the possibility of reactivating the Constitutional Committee, as well as other measures aimed at fulfilling the provisions of Resolution 2254 of 2015. Syria is living through the worst resurgence in armed violence of the last 4 years, according to information provided by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria. And in this regard, we deem it essential to reassess strategies which will allow for a return to constructive dialogue. President, last week, during the open debate on women, peace and security, we listened to states discussing the importance of including women in all processes of building and consolidating peace. This delicate and complex security situation is also an opportunity to involve women in a full, equal, meaningful and safe way. Women and young people must be involved in all the phases of the political negotiation process. We note with concern the information from OCHA on the situation of 15 million people who depend on humanitarian assistance to survive, as well as the increase in the number of displaced persons due to the recent escalation in hostilities and the damage caused to schools and in critical infrastructure, which contravenes international humanitarian law. We urge donors to continue contributing to the humanitarian response plan for Syria in 2023, which is only 30% funded as we approach the end of the year. President, I conclude by recalling that the end of November will see the expiry of the authorizations for the use of the border crossings of Bab al-Salam and Al-Rai, and in December, the use of Bab al-Hawa will expire. We trust that the access to the northwest of Syria will be maintained indefinitely, alongside the guarantees of safety and freedom of movement for United Nations personnel and that of its partner agencies on the ground. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank Special Envoy Patterson and Director Wosorno for their briefings. In light of the recent situation, in light of the briefings, I'd like to make the following points. First, every effort must be made to avoid spillover of tensions. The political process in Syria cannot advance without stable regional environment for some time now. Amidst the escalating Palestinian-Israeli conflict, tensions along the Syrian-Israeli border on the rise. A number of locations in Syria, including the airports in Damascus and Aleppo, came under frequent airstrikes. We call upon all parties concerned to exercise maximum restraint in order to avoid hotspots feeding off each other and the spread of conflict, wreaking greater havoc on regional security. We hope that countries outside the region, especially major countries, will uphold objectivity and impartiality and play a constructive role in cooling off the situation. One must not call for de-escalation while acting in a way that exacerbates tensions. Secondly, we must remain committed to seeking a political solution as the right way forward. China firmly supports the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process, calls on all parties in Syria to strengthen dialogue, narrow their differences, and make substantive progress in the work of the Constitutional Committee. We welcome the efforts of Special Envoy Patterson in line with the Steps for Steps initiative to engage extensively with all parties on the implementation of Resolution 2254. We support greater Arab solidarity and cooperation so as to give new impetus to the political solution to the Syrian issue. Thirdly, we must resolutely combat terrorist forces in Syria. China strongly condemns the terrorist attack on the Homs Military Academy earlier this month. We firmly support the Syrian government in taking the necessary measures to combat terrorism and maintain national security and stability. The international community should, in accordance with international law and Council resolutions, adopt uniform standards, step up counter-terror cooperation, and combat terrorist forces within Syria with zero tolerance. China opposes external forces interfering in Syria's internal affairs and undermining its security and stability, and opposes their illegal military presence, unlawful military operations, and looting of natural resources in Syria. Mr. President, China's position on the humanitarian issue in Syria is clear and consistent. We support the United Nations and the Syrian government in maintaining positive interaction and under the premise of fully respecting Syria's sovereignty and ownership of Syrian government, properly implementing new arrangements for cross-border humanitarian relief. All parties should also step up their efforts to clear the obstacles to cross-line delivery. At present, humanitarian aid for Syria is grossly underfunded. We call upon relevant donors to honor their commitments and support humanitarian action and early recovery projects throughout Syria. Unilateral sanctions have weakened the Syrian government's ability to mobilize resources, carry out reconstruction. Their negative impact on the humanitarian situation in Syria cannot be ignored or denied. These sanctions must be lifted without delay and without conditions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Mr. Pedersen and Ms. Wasomu for their briefings. I would like to talk about 3 points. The situation in Gaza at the moment risks a regional conflagration, but the spillover that would plunge the region into a war with incalculable consequences for all people is not inevitable. All members of this council must step up their diplomatic efforts to avoid this catastrophic scenario. France is standing here. The recent clashes in Syria with the mobilization of armed groups at the border with Israel run the risk of a spillover of the conflict into Syria. The opening of a new front against Israel in Syria would further destabilize the country, and the Syrian population would once again be the primary victims. The war in Gaza should not lead us to ignore ongoing violence in Syria and against Syrians. The regime's bombardments in the Idlib region are unjustifiable. These bombings have killed dozens of civilians, including children. They've damaged numerous civilian infrastructure buildings, without counting those who are already forced to move. As the Special Envoy has stated, a cessation of hostilities throughout the whole of Syria is necessary, in line with this Council's resolutions. This aim must go hand in hand with a credible and inclusive political process, in line with Resolution 2254. Regional tensions should not let us lose sight of this. I'd like to reiterate my country's support for Mr. Pedersen's mediation efforts and also for the Constitutional Committee. The conditions for a voluntary, sure and safe and dignified return of refugees to their country must be met. Damas must always present specific, verifiable commitments here. Acts must be followed. Must follow words. Words must be followed by actions. France will continue to provide support to all these people. So the resumption of the provision of humanitarian aid in the northwest of Syria is a good news that's come to us. Assistance that comes to this part of Syria is nonetheless insufficient. So this is a source of major concern, in particular with the onset of winter. 5.7 million people need humanitarian assistance. We need to help humanitarian stakeholders meet these needs. There's also a need for the Syrian regime to renew unconditionally in November its authorization for the 2 crossing points of Bab al-Shala and al-Rai. Humanitarian access must be safe and unhindered. The Council needs to remain seized with this issue. The Secretariat needs to give account in writing to the Council of the humanitarian response in Syria. Thank you.
I'll give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس أود في البداية
Mr. President, I would like first to thank Mr. Geir Pedersen and Ms. Edem Wasorno for their valuable briefings today. Our meeting today comes as our region is going through one of the most difficult crises in its modern history. We are witnessing another devastating war where civilians are suffering terribly in Gaza. Concerns are mounting with every passing day without ending this war about the possibility of the entire region sliding into a regional war, the damage of which would be tremendous for everyone. The growing tensions in the occupied Syrian Golan and other neighboring areas where over the past weeks confirm the urgent need to address the various crises in our region, including the Syrian crisis. Syria, still suffering from the repercussions of a more than 13-year war, cannot afford to become another front for settling geopolitical goals. The Syrian crisis is one of the most complex files due to foreign interference. Any new escalation would impede our ultimate goal of achieving peace and security in Syria and the entire region. Mr. President, The UAE supports the efforts of the Special Envoy and the Arab Contact Group to convene meetings of the Constitutional Committee at the end of this year. This would strengthen the dialogue between the Syrian parties to end the crisis under a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned process and without foreign interference. We stress that a political solution is the only way to resolve this crisis. Considering the recent increase in tensions and hostilities in Syria, the UAE stresses the importance of de-escalation, ensuring a ceasefire in all Syrian regions, and to refrain from targeting vital facilities, especially Aleppo Airport and Damascus Airport, to avoid hindering the delivery of humanitarian aid. The United Arab Emirates also stresses the importance of combating terrorist threats in Syria, especially as Daesh continues to launch attacks to destabilize security and stability in Syria. The UAE reiterates its strong condemnation of the terrorist attack that targeted the military academy in Homs in central Syria. The UAE denounces these criminal acts and firmly rejects all forms of violence and terrorism. We also express our sincere condolences and sympathies to the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, its people, and to the families of the victims who were killed in this heinous crime, and wish for a speedy recovery for all those injured. It is unfortunate that there was no clear condemnation by the Security Council of this terrorist attack. Mr. President, each year the economic situation has continued to deteriorate due to multiple factors. This includes the rise in prices of fuel, commodities, and food, as well as the decline of the Syrian pound to unprecedented levels. This situation demands that the international community explore ways to boost the Syrian economy, which in turn would improve the humanitarian and living conditions of the Syrian people. We also stress the importance of restoring water and electricity networks, which are essential for providing humanitarian services. In this regard, we express our appreciation at the continued efforts of OCHA and the Syrian government to seamlessly deliver humanitarian aid through the 3 crossings at the Syrian-Turkish border. As we approach the deadline of the extension next month, we hope that the opening of the Bab el-Salama and Bab el-Rai crossings will be further extended. This is necessary to ensure that the needs of the Syrian people are met, especially with the approaching winter season and the scarcity of basic resources and livelihoods. We reiterate the need to use all modalities to deliver aid, including by ensuring cross-line delivery of convoys. We urge to increase the number of these convoys in line with the humanitarian needs on the ground. In conclusion, Mr. President, the present turning point in our region requires intensifying efforts to prevent the escalation of tensions. This includes preventing Syria from sliding into a regional war and working simultaneously to make progress towards finding peaceful solutions for all crises in the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Brazil. Colleagues, Brazil fully associates itself with the speech of the Swiss delegation in our capacity as of co-pen holders of the Syrian humanitarian file. I now speak in my national capacity on the political aspects of the Syrian conflict. I thank Mr. Geir Pedersen and Ms. Fosorno for their comprehensive briefings and commend their work. I welcome the delegations of Iran, Syria, and Turkey to this meeting. We, the members of the Security Council, hold this meeting at a moment of dangerous escalation of violence in Syria and in the region. Indeed, the recent developments in Syria are cause for grave concern. On October 5th, we learned with distress of the terrorist attack against the graduation ceremony at the Military Academy of Homs, which left more than 100 dead, including civilians, among which many children. Brazil expresses its condolences to the relatives and friends of the victims and reiterates its firm repudiation of any acts of terrorism and attacks to the civilian population. The situation in northern Syria has deteriorated even more. In the country's northwest, there have been reports of airstrikes in Idlib with civilian casualties and great damage to civilian infrastructure, as well as attacks by the Security Council-listed terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. In the northeast, there have been worrisome reports of violence, which included strikes affecting civilian infrastructure. Since the beginning of hostilities between Israel and Hamas, Syria has been affected by the conflict on more than one occasion. Strikes on Aleppo and Damascus airports have disrupted United Nations humanitarian air service flights more than once. Some days ago, strikes on facilities in eastern Syria were reported. Sadly, as these events point out, the situation in Syria remains very much volatile, with dire consequences for the civilian population. The risk of a regional spillover of the Israel-Hamas conflict is real and a ground for deep concern. In this context of growing instability, we renew our appeal to all sides to exercise maximum restraint. We recall that Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected in accordance with international law and this Council's relevant resolutions. We also recall that all sides must comply with their obligations under international law and ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We have repeatedly stated that there is no military solution to the Syrian conflict. In light of the unfolding humanitarian crisis and the deteriorating security conditions in Syria, an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire is urgently needed. The Syrian people cannot afford further losses and additional damage to critical infrastructure. At the same time, renewed political will is essential to resume a credible intra-Syrian political process, especially with the reconvening of the Constitutional Committee. In this spirit, we encourage all parties to work towards the resumption of the UN-facilitated political process. We concur with the Special Envoy that the status quo in Syria is unsustainable and that without a meaningful political path to implement Council Resolution 2254, we risk further deterioration of the situation in the country. It would have detrimental effects for the region, especially in the current volatile context. Diplomacy and true political will must be given a true chance. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Syria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. The world's eyes are fixed at the Israeli aggression in our region today. The aggression continues where the occupying forces have committed dozens of massacres and brutal attacks and crimes in Gaza. Israel continues to launch the flaming fire in the region. And in only 10 days, there have been 4 attacks against 2 civilian airports in Syria, which has halted the operation of the 2 airports and have also led to hindering the humanitarian operations of the United Nations. The Syrian Arab Republic, while it warns once again against the continued aggression, and while we call on the Security Council to end its silence and to uphold its responsibility and condemn these attacks and hold their perpetrators accountable, Syria also considers that the protection and the guaranteed immunity provided to Israel by the United States of America and some other states makes them partners in the responsibility for these serious violations of international law and the UN Charter. Mr. President, in parallel with these Israeli attacks, the terrorists continue their crimes against the Syrian people. On the 5th of October, through support of known states led by the United States of America, have committed one of their most brutal and bloodiest crimes when drones targeted a graduation ceremony of the military academy in Homs, which led to dozens of victims and hundreds injured, and their families who are civilians who were attending the ceremony, including women and children. The Syrian Arab Republic affirms that this act will not dissuade our efforts to eliminate terrorism from our territory. In this same context, the United States of America continues its blatant violations against the Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity through its illegal military presence on Syrian territory and its support for separatist militia in the northeast. These militia have recently shelled two water plants in Deir ez-Zor using drones, leading to their halted operation and depriving tens of thousands of Syrians of drinking water. In addition, the U.S. sends its agents to illegally cross into Syrian territory. And there was previously an assistant a secretary of defense who came to Syria, which proves the destructive role of the U.S. in Syria and which prolongs the crisis and the suffering. The U.S. and the European Union continue their unilateral, coercive, illegal, inhuman measures, depriving the Syrians of their most basic human rights, such as the right to food, health, education, development, leading to economic and humanitarian suffering that is unprecedented and that is further exacerbated boldly by the U.S. Through the looting of national wealth, including wheat, gas, and oil. Mr. President, within our Syrian efforts to improve the humanitarian situation, we continue to promote our cooperation with the UN and its agencies and programs, including through issuing the necessary permits to carry out their operations throughout Syria. In this context, through a sovereign decree, we have approved the use of 3 border crossings and 2 cross lines within our territory to deliver the necessary assistance to Syrian civilians. However, the entry of assistance through Bab al-Hawa crossing was delayed for longer than 2 months, and only one convoy has entered cross-line into the areas requiring the assistance, which reveals the real parties preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid. Therefore, we emphasize the need to bring pressure to bear on the terrorists in Syria in order for the assistance to reach the needed persons. Mr. President, the UN efforts face a serious challenge. The lack of funding is the largest obstacle preventing the operation. The humanitarian response plan has only been funded by 29.3%. It is as though someone is deliberately prolonging the critical humanitarian situation in Syria, in particular after the earthquake of last February. This is a time when Syrians need long-term solutions a need to rely less on assistance. Mr. President, Syria reiterates once again that we welcome the return of every refugee who was forced to leave the country because of terrorism and because of the negative impact of the coercive measures. In this context, Syria continues every effort to facilitate the return of refugees and continues to cooperate with the UNHCR, including through the promotion of the communication channels with the UNHCR in order to address all concerns related to refugees. We also emphasize that the dignified and voluntary return requires conditions to allow for the return, including the lifting of the unilateral coercive measures and quick impact projects, as well as the removal of mines. As for the humanitarian situation in Al-Rukban camp, it is the responsibility of the illegal U.S. military presence, and it can be addressed through the removal and closure of this camp. The same situation applies to El Hol camp, which is controlled by separatist militias. This camp must also be discontinued. Syria condemns all these American practices, including its support for terrorist groups, separatist militias, and its efforts to maintain the status quo at the camp. The expanded consequences of the Syrian crisis require sincere political will from Security Council members in order to end the repeated Israeli attacks and end the illegal foreign presence on Syrian territory, and to immediately and unconditionally remove the coercive measures and to support the Syrian state and its institutions in order to improve the humanitarian situation without discrimination. In addition, donors must uphold their pledges, and we must increase the early recovery projects. Mr. President, allow me, before concluding, to mention the U.S. statement. We have heard allegations of the right to self-defense. The ambassador said their forces in Syrian territory. She has forgotten that these forces are illegally present in Syrian territory. It appears that the United States of America afford themselves the right for their forces to exist anywhere at any time without any approval or consent and in full violation of the law. It has used as a justification the war on Daesh, which is American-made. I would like to remind the U.S. ambassador of its country's history that is full of black episodes, especially in the Middle East, through the destruction of Iraq based on lies, and lately the full support and unconditional support for Israel. It has not sufficed in the previous days to impede the work of the Security Council to protect the Palestinian people. However, they have supported the Israeli war machine through its carriers and military aid, in addition to financial aid in the amount of billions of dollars. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful. Mr. President, I thank Mr. Peterson, the special envoy, and Ms. Osorno for the update and informative briefings. Regrettably, after 12 years of the Syrian crisis, terrorism remains a significant and persistent threat to Syria and broader region, with its core activities concentrated in regions outside the control of the Syrian government. We are concerned about the terrorist activities in the areas under occupation. The illegal presence of U.S. military forces in Syria is the primary source of insecurity in the country and has provided fertile ground for the nourishment of terrorist organizations, both within the country and the broader region. Syrian Arab Republic has officially and consistently raised objections to these violations and has called upon the Security Council to halt these aggressions and put an end to the U.S. occupation. The fight against terrorism must be carried out in full respect of Syria's national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, and without using it as a pretext to violate these fundamental principles of international law. Mr. President, Iran strongly condemns reprehensible terrorist attacks perpetrated by the terrorist organization targeting the graduation ceremony for the cadet of the military academy in the city of Homs on 4th October. This cowardly act of terrorism has tragically resulted in numerous lost life and injured, including civilians, military personnel, and their innocent family members. It is deeply regrettable that the Security Council continued to exhibit political double standards and refused to condemn such heinous and horrifying crimes. Further, Iran condemns in the strongest terms the continuous act of terrorism carried out by the Israeli regime within Syrian territory, deliberately targeting innocent civilians and vital infrastructure. The most recent attack was conducted in Idlib last night. These acts of aggression are a serious threat to the regional peace and security, while concurrently committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Gaza Strip. The Israeli regime conducted aggressive operations aimed at the civilian airport in Damascus and Aleppo. These terrorist attacks inflicted severe damage to the essential airport facilities, causing significant disruption to their operations and for considerable duration. Tragically, these assaults also led to loss of lives and injured among several innocent civilians. Mr. President, the humanitarian crisis in Syria remains deeply concerning. Currently, one of the most urgent issues facing the country is severe economic hardship, significantly worsened by the so-called Caesar sanctions. These sanctions have placed a disproportionate burden on the Syrian people, particularly women and children. These illegal measures have sadly transformed into instruments that terrorize nations and erode the bedrock of international law. We are also concerned about the current level of funding for the Syrian humanitarian response. The current level of funding allocated for the Syrian humanitarian response falls far below that needed. The severe shortage of funding severely hinders the UN ability to provide adequate assistance to those in need. As much, the provision of impartial and non-politicized humanitarian assistance to all regions of Syria is crucial for saving lives. We stress the humanitarian assistance and reconstruction initiative in Syria should not be wielded as tools to exert pressure on the Syrian government. Mr. President, on political track, we hold a steadfast belief that the essential solution to the Syrian crisis should be pursued through diplomatic and political means, as a military solution has the potential to exacerbate an already complex situation. We highlight the significance of resuming the meeting of the Constitutional Committee as an effective mechanism for advancing the political process. The continued functioning of this committee is vital, with its venue being of lesser importance. The role of the United Nations should remain supportive, with the entire process being under Syrian leadership and ownership. We support the return of Syrian refugees to their homeland. At present, there exists a significant number of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and their return should be facilitated through the cooperative efforts of all those host countries. Addressing the numerous challenges confronting Syrian refugees require the certain of critical infrastructure. The United Nations, especially the High Commissioner for Refugees, plays a pivotal role in this endeavor. I wish to emphasize the importance of respecting the territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and independence of Syrian Arab Republic. Iran reaffirmed its steadfast commitment to fight against terrorism. To conclude, Mr. President, in response to the unfounded allegation raised against my country by representatives of the United States during this meeting, we are obliged to emphatically refute these unsubstantiated claims. They have no basis and are completely without merit. The U.S. attempts to shift the blame from the culprit to the victims and put finger on Iran. Iran has consistently upheld its commitment to promoting peace and security in the region. Iran's presence in Syria is fully legal and in response to an official request from the Syrian government to combat terrorism. The effectiveness of Iran's anti-terrorism efforts, particularly against terrorist groups like Daesh, is evident to all. In stark contrast, the unlawful presence of the United States in Syria, purportedly for counterterrorism purposes, but with support for terrorist organizations, flagrantly violate the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. This destabilizing presence has had advanced repercussions for both Syria and the entire region. The Syrian Arab Republic has officially and consistently raised objection to these violations and has called upon the Security Council to halt this aggression and put an end to the U.S. occupation. The United States must rectify its transgressions of international law and UN Charter by discontinuing its support for terrorist groups and withdraw from the northeastern region of Syria. Mr. President, it is indeed that the U.S. is seeking to increase escalation, but overtly aligning itself with the aggressor at the expense of the innocent Palestinian people. The United States and some Western countries attempt to equate the self-defense and right of self-determination of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian resistance with terrorism, attempting to grant the occupying regime Israel an unjust right to self-defense. The United States' unwavering support for occupation and aggression has rendered it a part of the problem and the challenge the international community in facing in the current situation in Gaza Strip. Let me be clear, Mr. President, Iran's primary objective is to avoid any escalation in the region. That is why Iran has aligned with the international community to endorse the call for an immediate end to Israeli relentless military aggression, establishing a ceasefire and providing unhindered access to humanitarian aid to the people in need in Gaza Strip. However, should it confront any threat, attack, or aggression endangering its security, national interests, or its people, Iran will not hesitate to use its inherent right on the international law and the UN Charter to respond decisively. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. International community's continued attention to the humanitarian situation in Syria is crucial. The conditions remain especially dire in the northwest, where 4.1 million people need critical life-saving humanitarian assistance. Increasing number of attacks by the regime in Greater Idlib area disrupt essential services. Therefore, the safe and uninterrupted continuation of the UN cross-border humanitarian assistance, as long as needed, is a humanitarian imperative. The non-extension of the Council mandate last July led to significant uncertainty and risks to this critical operation. 8 shipments had to stop for more than 2 months. And this disruption occurred just a few months after the earthquakes, which caused further destruction in the region. Going forward, the Syrian regime and the members of the Security Council have important responsibilities to eliminate the risks. In this context, we expect the continued use of Bab al-Hawa, Bab al-Salam, and Al-Rai border crossings for UN aid deliveries beyond mid-November and January 2024 time limits. This is especially critical given the approaching winter months, when typically the humanitarian needs are at their highest. The international community, especially the UN Security Council, should closely follow the course of this operation and stand ready to step in if needed. The continued monitoring and reporting of cross-border aid deliveries by the UN in line with existing modalities are also critical to ensure the transparency and oversight of this massive operation. As with all large-scale humanitarian operations, humanitarian funding is another fundamental requirement for effective cross-border assistance to Syria. The UN Syria Humanitarian Response Plan is funded less than 30%, which is a source of concern. We reiterate our call for sufficient and sustained funding so that the United Nations can continue to carry out its humanitarian operations for millions of Syrians in need. Mr. President, the developments in the Middle East since the 7th of October have painfully reminded once again that the recurrent cycles of crisis, hostilities, and violence are inevitable if political solutions are not developed to address the root causes of conflicts. This reality should always be kept in mind when dealing with the Syrian crisis as well. The fact is that the root causes of the Syrian conflict are political. Syrian people have legitimate aspirations still unmet after 12 years of conflict. In the absence of national reconciliation, Syria will continue to suffer from the repercussions of an ongoing conflict. Current escalation in Israeli-Palestinian conflict brings new risks for the wider region, and Syria is not immune to those risks. Special attention is required in the current critical juncture so that the spiral of violence does not drag Syria into further instability. The formula for ending the Syrian conflict is clear. The international community must ensure simultaneous progress in the following 3 tracks: the revitalization of the political process in line with Security Council Resolution 2254, creating the conditions for safe, voluntary, and dignified return of Syrian refugees, and disrupting the malign and separatist agenda of the terrorist organizations in order to preserve Syria's territorial integrity and unity. Mr. President, we have international consensus on the significance of implementing the Security Council Resolution 2254. For this, we have to work together to reactivate the Constitutional Committee as soon as possible. The Constitutional Committee is the only platform that brings the Syrian opposition and the regime together under the UN facilitation. The opposition is a building block in the political process, without which there can be no national reconciliation. Therefore, the opposition should not be sidelined. We remain in close contact with Special Envoy Pedersen in his efforts to create momentum in the political track. Mr. President, currently, the biggest threat to territorial integrity of Syria, as well as to the prospects of a united and peaceful future for this country, is the terrorist organizations operating on its soil. Through its activities inside Syria, PKK-PYD and its offshoot, the so-called SDF, constitute the textbook example of a separatist terrorist organization. It kills and maims civilians, oppresses and terrorizes local populations, abducts and recruits children. PKK bans school curricula, closes Arabic teaching schools, arrests teachers, and releases Daesh members in exchange for bribes. Turkey shares 911 kilometers of land border with Syria. The presence of PKK-PYD terrorist organization in this country, just beyond our borders, poses a vital threat to our national security. This terrorist organization has been using the refuge and the support it receives in Syria for attacking Turkey. The terrorists who perpetrated the attack in front of the Ministry of Interior in Ankara on the 1st of October were trained in Syria and they entered Turkey from Syria. PKK-YPG also continues to launch terrorist attacks from Tel Rifat and Manbij region. Turkey conducts counter-terrorism operations against PKK-PYD terrorism, an exercise of its inherent right to self-defense in line with the Article 51 of the UN Charter and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. These operations exclusively target terrorists and terrorist capabilities, which are directly linked with the functioning and financing of the terrorist organization. We are determined not to allow PKK terrorist organization find safe haven along our borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
The representative of Turkey for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.